Hello. So, just a few things by way of introduction. William Kentridge can draw like a bandit. We know all that. But what's miraculous about his work is how a quick, broad gesture of charcoal on paper, repeated, and then repeated again, becomes a bird, becomes wing, becomes flight, whole oceans, but at the same time retains the scope of the artist's hand and literally the arm of Kentridge himself, and then becomes an army. And all that takes place in one fluid motion. I just find it a kind of miracle. It's an art of kind of miraculous elision, and as we'll see later tonight, collision. And that in itself would be motivation enough to play host to his latest great adventure in art, music, dance, and theater. But there's another miracle, which is this. For me, it's a little personal. For the first time ever, I think, probably the last, William Kentridge provoked in me just a whiff of sympathy for Donald Trump. And I'm talking about the hand thing here. Several months ago, William was sizing up MoCA as a potential venue workshop, and after inspecting the place from stem to stern, he turned to me and said, "Yes, well, your hunter is a bit small." Which of course made us hell-bent for leather to host this residency, inadequacy being stimulating, as we all know. A third motivation, and this too is a little bit personal, was a feeling of kind of ill-informed stupidity that just swept over me when William and his executive producer and our curator of performing arts, Rachel Chanoff, explained the content of this work to me. I've never felt quite so dumb and sort of mortified, actually. Well, and that's not quite true. As an undergraduate art history major at Williams College, in one of our first big survey courses, the really wonderful art history teacher, Ava Gruden, interrupted us in the middle of a survey. We were all ensconced safely in early European modernism, and out of the blue, she asked us to draw Africa. She made us sign the work. I remember she insisted that it be a big, legible signature. And then she hung our rather shameful drawings on the hall outside the art history faculty for what seemed like an eternity to me. You know, the drawing just had to capture political borders, rivers, geographic high points, and it was interesting to see. Hearing William describe the topic of the head and the load brought back that feeling of mortification to me, running back in that my terrible drawing of Africa, and in this case, my utter lack of knowledge of Africa in World War I. So the work of the last 2 weeks have had a certain kind of urgency for me. As you'll later see, the work is still in studio, in rehearsal. It's beautifully fragile, loose-jointed. A former trustee told me once, as I was trying to explain how MoCA should be as much art workshop as museum, he said to me that the relationship of an art studio to the history of art is the relationship of sin to religion. And if that's true, and I think it is in a way, then I guess William is sort of a grand madame overseeing here what surely is one of the world's largest and most exciting brothels in the world right now when it comes to art. Joining William now is Homi K. Bhabha, the Anne Rothenberg Professor of Humanities at Harvard, whose work promotes not so much a singular point of view, but rather urges a rather generous unfurling of multiplicity and contradiction, elevating ambivalence to a kind of ennobling state of fine art. And if you have mixed feelings about ambivalence, I think Professor Bhabha would urge us to not put those feelings at rest now. I'm Joe Thompson, Director of MoCA, and along with my extraordinary colleagues, Rachel and Sue Killam and her really fine team who have shared the great pleasure of hosting William and his creative team, his battalion here in our midst, join me now in welcoming William Kentridge and Homi K. Bhabha. Thank you very much.
Maybe just to give a little bit of context to the conversation. Homi invited me some years ago to Harvard, to the Mahindra Humanities Center, to deliver the series of lectures known as the Norton Lectures at Harvard. And since then, we've been in ongoing and varied conversations about topics of mutual interest, which have included bits of literature, questions of colonialism, and many of the topics that are examined in the work that you will see this evening. So it's a continuation rather than a fresh conversation that we're doing. And there are various topics that we hope to touch on, and Homi will add other ones if I forget them. But to talk about walking, to talk about the spasm of history, to talk about language, to talk about collage. But we thought a starting point might well be to be talking about carriers. The piece of theatre, The Head and the Load, that's in preparation downstairs in the Hunter Theatre, from which I've escaped from this hour for rehearsal while they wrangle with some of the problems of the relationship between the piano and an exploding box. I've left to them. But the piece started as an examination of Africa in the First World War, and specifically the carriers. Most of the participants who were either in Africa or came from Africa to Flanders were laborers. They were soldiers from Senegal, but the vast majority were carriers, people who actually carried the load of the war. And in Africa, this was necessary, or this happened because A, there were no railways, and B, it was not possible to use beasts of burden. Because of tsetse fly and the diseases they've got, there was a 100% mortality rate of horses every month, so a horse would survive a month. So literally the war was put on people's heads, and the war material carried thousands of miles from southern Africa to what is now Tanzania, German East Africa, where the war was fought in Africa to determine who would own the colonies. And in that sense, one can think of the whole of the First World War as a completion of the Conference of Berlin, of the division of Africa amongst European powers, and see the questions of colonialism at the heart rather than the edges of the war. And the point of connection with Homi, one of them, is the question of the nature of those bearers and the questions of both the representation of them, which has been in my work in different forms for a long time, and Homi's reflections on the nature of the bearers in the steppe.
Thank you, William. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you, Max MoCA, for, I said Max MoCA, for inviting me. I think the figure of the carrier, literally the person who carries the load on the head, on the neck, on the shoulders, is part of a very interesting idea in William's work, that one should think about those who are made anonymous, those who are seen to be anonymous. And I just want to read this little passage from William, just to put the carrier in context, where he says, who are these anonymous carriers? This is from an earlier work. Taken for granted by Plato, taken for granted by us as we see them walking through the streets of Johannesburg, streets of so many cities in the world, carrying loads, they're peasants, the proletariat, the unemployed, people at the margins of society. As Wojciech says, if ever we get to heaven, they would still have to help us to make the thunder. So there is both in the carrier a notion of labor and also a notion of the performing body. The body that carries, the body that walks, the body that has to actually present itself. And for Williams, in Williams' work, I think, the carrier is a very archetypal figure. And if you just think about it historically for a minute, the regulations were that carriers in the First World War, African and Indian, should carry up to 40 to 70 pounds and walk for up to 15 miles a day. Now, once the war started, these regulations were no longer operative, and people used the carriers. Carriers were actually then, when they were thrown away, more or less like surplus, once they were dead, once the work had consumed them.
I mean, it's interesting that the term that was used for the carriers that didn't survive, that died, was called the wastage. What is the wastage rate for carriers? But it's also the anonymity is an interesting question, because on the one hand, you say, well, there wasn't a marking of writing down of names in villages where people had come from, but there was also a much more willful amnesia. There were decisions made in the War Office that black participants in the war should not be part of the victory parade in 1919. The excuse was it was too expensive to bring people from Southern Africa to Europe for it. But there was also a decision, for example, not to give medals. And the reason for that, they said, was that these people had been there as laborers, not as combatants, even though they were as much under fire and died from the war as combatants themselves. So they were it's not a sin just of omission. There were also deliberate sins of commission, in the sense that as soon as a humanity was ascribed to these laborers, it would be harder and harder to deny any humanity in the sphere of human rights in the colonies afterwards. And there's this astonishingly painful hope of so many African politicians that the war and their devotion to France, as one of the French African politicians said, we offer a harvest of devotion to France. There was a sense of hope that if they were shown to participate in the war, they would be seen, they would exist, they would be given rights, they would be, and of course all of those, as one of the other people said, none of our dreams ever came true.
And not only did they not come true, but what's so interesting about carriers was that from the 19th century onwards, in Europe, where there were carriers, European carriers, this was seen to be heinous. People in the 1880s said, this is worse than the Negro trades. So it was very much known that there was a kind of profound exploitation. But the word for carriers, and I think this is actually relevant, because the great thing I feel about great artists, William amongst them, Toni Morrison, somebody else I've worked with, is as Toni once said, if you have to say it, don't bother. You just have to show it in the work. And I think that's why I've been trying to draw out these figures in Williams' work. And the carrier was known as, the attempt to recruit a carrier was called impressioned, to be impressioned. And I thought this was rather fine because of the making of the work, creating the impression, and capturing the carrier was known as the impression. But in Williams' work, the paradoxes that are in almost every moment of the work, both formal and otherwise, it's very true about carriers. Carriers were often the slaves of the African tribal leaders. The European powers went in and justified imperialism and colonialism because they wanted to destroy these kinds of, as they said, these exploitative social and economic relations. But very often, as I discovered, carriers were actually borrowed by the Europeans from the slaveholders and then returned to the slaveholders after the war. And in fact, there's a wonderful text, which I won't read, but I'll allude to here, where you actually hear about a carrier in southern Nigeria. He said, I was at home, suddenly I was snatched, a belt was put around my neck, and I was told, you will be taken away to fight the Germans so that your village can be safe. So this notion of the paradox of the carrier, the person who was, who represented the paradoxes of empire, but was this very anonymous and marginal figure. It also works the other way. Veterans who were part of the carrier trade then became African nationalists. So the ambivalence that the director talked about works in both ways.
Yeah, I mean, just to go on with that paradox, in Senegal, for example, you had the communes, which were the cities in which the tiny percentage of educated black Senegalese lived, including the first black member of the Chamber of Deputies, first deputy in France. And he argued very forcefully against a lot of conservative French politicians for the right to fight in the war. So you had a kind of an educated elite wanting to be part of the war, but in the rural areas of Senegal, people were literally captured the way they had been captured in slave raids. A headman would be, told he had to present so many people. As one of the people writes, a rope was put through their ears. They were linked through the earlobes and marched off. So the fact that these two groups work together, and I mean not work together, but they're both such different contradictory positions in the society, when in one sense you would expect less educated people to be saying, this is not our war. What are you expecting us to die for? And other people saying, well, maybe we're off to Europe. And it was very much a contradiction that goes right into the heart of I think, colonial nationalism. The revolts during the First World War were microcosms of larger African nationalist revolts that happened over 50 years. And I think these are all the kind of questions that, the provocations, not questions because we don't have answers to them, but provocations for the work to be made. And I suppose the work is really a marker of these, saying we note these questions as unsolved and ongoing.
But it also, this condition that we've been describing as the paradoxical or ambivalent nature of porterage or carriers goes to the heart of your work. Because two of the concepts in your work, which are enacted repeatedly, is the notion of fortuna, that something can suddenly happen in the work that changes our entire framework of understanding. And in a way, the fate of the carrier was that something happened which changed the entire framework of their lives, very often, turned carriers into nationalists on the one hand, but also slaves on the other. And the other concept, William, that I think works as a form of time in your work, and is visible very much in the structure of the work, is the layering of time. The idea that you'd express sometimes with the word whilst. Whilst this was happening at this point, that was happening at another point. So this notion of the whilst, the way in which your work layers time and space is very well suited to the problem of carriers.
I mean, the notion of time is an interesting one. And obviously when we're working in the theatre downstairs, it's a kind of thinking in the material of the movement of the performers, of the dancers, the projections, the text, how they fit together. And there's an interesting piece that we were working on yesterday about duration and time. And it's very simple. There's a projector at the front of the stage. And if you're very close to the projector, of course, you throw a huge shadow on the wall. And if you're close to the back of the stage, your shadow is more or less the same height as yourself. So this forward and backward movement of maybe 8 meters, 8 yards, changes you from a small shadow to a huge shadow. And it's a sequence of people running from explosions, and they run towards the projection and go back. And there is an extraordinary, palpable sense of exhaustion in the running. And then you think, how could these actors how could these dancers be doing this for so many hours? And at the end you realize, no, that was only 3 minutes of running. Most of us can run 3 minutes on a treadmill. We may be tired, but we would manage. We can't run as fast or as well as these runners. But there's a complete shift in one's head of duration, which is a practical question. I mean, it's something one discovers when one watches it rather than knows in advance. And I think one of the pleasures of the project is taking the questions which we're discussing now, but not putting them on stage, but allowing the stage to provoke to do the thinking about them. The step, the nature of the step. What is the nature of the walk? There's a lot of people just walking from one side of the stage to the other. And what is the walk that feels appropriate? What is the walk that feels too staged? What is the walk that's too casual? These are all both practical and questions deeply rooted in the things we're talking about.
Absolutely. And as you've said very often, you walk the studio yourself to think the thought. You, in a way, walk the thought. And walking is, again, I think, at the heart of your work, but also at the heart of the figure of the porter. Because porters measured the distances of both labor and life through the process of walking. Labor, life, and death, actually. So walking is a measure of time. Walking is not simply motion, it's a measure of time. And I think that comes out beautifully in the performance because you can continually change it. You take the unit of the walk, you translate it into standing still, in the stop-start animation of your work, you turn it into dance, you turn it into running, and then you change the scale of walking by showing it as a shadow, almost in another medium. So, but distances, therefore, were at the heart of the question of the carrier, of the life of the carrier. The other issue that was to do with walking is the distance from the home to which they belonged and to where they were taken. And this sense of estrangement in their lives through the very processes of walking further and further, this sense of non-belonging also created very often a sense of estrangement about culture and language.
I mean, there's the question of the estrangement of saying, you're walking and walking to what purpose, to what purpose? So this is, you can say this is an existential question. What is your life if you were walking? But it turns into a completely, it's demonstrated in a completely practical way. So that if you're walking 3 miles, you don't need that much food for yourself, and you're mainly carrying the war material and the load. But if your hike is over 20 days, you are carrying of 20 days, what you have to carry also is the minimum food you need to sustain yourself that the next step can be taken. And there's a point where the load that you're carrying is more and more that to keep you walking and less of actual material for the war. So that if you go over 22 days, all you're carrying is yourself. And it is, what is the purpose of this? The existential question of what does this mean becomes shown by the fact that you're carrying 2 bullets, and that's all. And of course, more practically, if you were a carrier who went far away, there were enormous problems. So if you come from Uganda, then sweet potatoes and beans would have been your diet. And when you were changed to the military regime of biscuit and wheat, tens of thousands of people died of dysentery very, very quickly. There was a gut that was just not used to eating one food. So there were extraordinary institutional inefficiencies and callousnesses which were there that led to this extraordinary death rate. I think we should go on to talk about language and contradiction.
That's what I wanted to do, actually, and to talk about what we've called the spasm of history. Because what we've been talking about is the way in which a system that considered itself functional, rational, very productive, was in fact undoing itself at the same time. So we talked about the various paradoxes. The carrier who becomes the nationalist leader, the slave who is used by the British who want to destroy slavery and then return to the slaver. Now these contradictions, William, show up in your work, I think, in terms of what I earlier called the palimpsests, the layering, and the collages that the work produces. Different time scales, different lifetimes, different time patterns working at the same time.
In this one, we're working, this is very deliberately trying to see, is collage a way of any kind of not historical explanation, and not mimicry, but a way of thinking or thinking about it. So there are sections which come from kind of documentary material about the carriers. There's sections which are inspired by Dadaism, about the impossibility of coherence of language, about language at the edge of making sense. When Europe could not hear the most clear language that was being spoken in Africa, people saying, why should we be going to die for your war? was an inaudible thing. It could not be comprehended, could not make sense.
Inaudible, and yet in your work audible, and audible in the work of many other writers, this particular intensity of contradiction or paradox, which we've called the spasm of history. History as it's happening in a kind of actualization, now, transition, change, things we understand, things we don't understand. I think that's what we've been calling this collage or even montage of history. But in your work, there is the repetition in the manifesto of the word kaboom and the use of Dada language. And Dada is sound-based rather than sign-based communication. It's the content is not as important as the sound. It's the ka-ata, 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 rather than the cat. So I think that this is a very productive way of showing how these paradoxes built up, and writers and artists pick them up. If you think about E.M. Forster's Passage to India, the book turns on the great Marabar caves, making this incomprehensive sound, oo-boom, oo-boom. It's almost as if the thing that cannot be spoken in language is spoken in this sound without sign. If you think about Conrad's Heart of Darkness, a central moment in that book is about this French frigate just going boom, boom, bombing the bush. And the narrator says, but why are you doing this? They say, oh, there must be people there who are our enemies. We just have to keep going boom, boom, boom. So art has found this language which is not immediately comprehensible, but creates at the same time this intense affective feeling of these incontrovertible contradictions in what would seem to be the most progressive nations of the world, the most liberal nations of the world. And these moments of Dada, I think, as spasms of history, are about self-reflection more than they are about the reflection of others. And I think this is what the work, as much as I've seen of it, brings out so intensely and so passionately.
I mean, I think for us the test is how wide, what is the line we can walk between saying, yes, it's about this period of history, it's about these questions, but that a central part of it is the languages where language is kind of breaking down. So where the edge of sense, whether it's Morse code, so language just becomes a series of signs. So we had a lot of fun writing Hungarian Morse code, French Morse code, English Morse code, the English one being a series of ash, 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 dust, 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 ash, ash, taking all the euphemisms of blood being the sweet wine of youth, and of courage being gallantry, and a whole series of, and death being dust and ash. So using those words for the Morse code, but then also using things like the Anthem for Doomed Youth, the poem, which is shattered not by being literally cut up by scissors, as in the Dadaist way, but cut up by a faltering memory of people of my generation who would have learnt it at high school. I'm sure it's not taught at high school anymore, but can vaguely remember, what passing bells for what passing bells for those who die as cattle, only the rapid, so it becomes a kind of Morse code, and which stands in for other things that we can't comprehend.
But the other thing that you do with the Dada, and this kind of, let's call it a kind of post-colonial Babel, this Babel, because it's a critique. It's a language of critique. Is to almost kind of imitate and change the scale of the language of command, which very often porters and soldiers from other countries, they were drilled to follow a command that they didn't even understand very often. But like animals, they were drilled to do it. And you bring that nonsense, not the nonsense simply, but the nonsense of the colonial moment very much to the fore.
I mean, the way we're trying to do that, I mean, there is a section where, and the command is given, what is the relationship of a porter or a soldier to these commands, to obey them, to not obey them, to be going with them. Do I join the army and offer a harvest of devotion? Or do I say, why should I go and die for a war that is not my own? To put that contradiction in the body. And in this, we have an astonishing dance, Gregory Makoma, who is the choreographer and part of the core creative team of the piece, trying to find in his movements of going or not going, of saluting, of not saluting, of hearing commands or not. And when he is on fire and it takes off, all of these ideas are just, without naming them as these ideas, are there present on stage.
So anxiety is very central. You know, political anxiety, psychic anxiety is, I think, very central to the way in which you take these ideas of the spasm of history, of paradox, and work them out through a performance. Would you not say, William, that even the moments where one kind of language, what you call the edge, reaches its edge and loses its communicability, in your work, another kind of language then takes over. So when the linguistic yields in a way to the visual yields to the musical. So it's sort of rather like a daisy chain, which is leading you down the primrose path, if I might put those different things together. And I love that sense of danger that you manage to, to enact.
I mean, that's it's kind of you to say that, but there are many things where it just falls flat, where it doesn't work. We're struggling at the moment with a section which is the cutting up of the continent of Africa, or section of looking at different maps and things on them, using not the text of the Conference of Berlin, but the sound poem of Kurt Schwitter's, a fragment of the Ursonate, which the generals used to discuss it. But which, in fact, as you're talking about the daisy chain, really works as the provocation for a duet between the shadows of two dancers. And I say the duet for the shadows, not for the dancers, because if you think of the V of the projection, the shape of a projection from a projector to the wall, if you have two projectors quite far apart, their shadow will meet, their beam of light will meet on the wall, and people standing in front of each of those projectors on the wall will be next to each other, even though they're in fact 20 yards apart on the stage. So they're dancing a solo, but their shadows are dancing a duet. And that has to go together with the rhythm of the Ursonate, plus show different parts of the corners of Africa. It's a heady but not certain occupation all the time.
Yeah, well, this is the imposing, the impression that we talked about. Coolies and in the Indian equivalent of the carriers were called coolies. They were impressed. And somehow you take those lives, those histories, the war, and create these impressions. And I wanted to ask you how you think shadow plays out, as you were just describing it. Shadow plays out the double lives of each of these figures. You know, they're dancing in one medium, and then there is another medium, the wall, the shadow, light, the negative light. This double perspective that you always manage to capture so beautifully when you talk about the paradoxes.
Well, the shadows are fantastic things, because we understand that your own shadow is connected to you, but it's not the same as you. And to do this, if you just think of a child on a beach in the late afternoon, if you're on the right side of the world, where a long shadow is thrown by the setting sun across the sand, and you can raise your hand, and your elongated shadow raises its hand, but of course your hand is moving 2 foot, and the shadow is moving 20 foot. And you try to stand on someone else's shadow, and you duck and you weave, and the shadow is so much more nimble, so much faster, so much more elusive than the person casting it. So there's that kind of power you sense saying, look how good my shadow is, as if that's an attribute and skill of yourself. So there's that connection to a shadow. And also shadow loses its dimensionability. So when you see a shadow, if you see a hand, it will throw a clear shadow on the wall, but if you push it straight into the line, it disappears, it becomes incomprehensible. So a shadow shows you it always has to be this relationship between the point of light and the object that is casting the shadow, and that you understand then that the coherence of the world or the shadow is in that relationship then of itself. And I think that making conscious what we do when we look is part of the interest in shadow.
That's why I called it this double projection. And if we can move from the shadow to another recurrent form of the amplification, just like the shadow casts something, scale changes. The amplification of voice through megaphone, through loudness and softness, diminution of tone. That plays a great part, doesn't it?
In this piece, it's because we're working with a stage that in final performances will be 60 yards long. Here we've got about 35 yards in the Hunter Theatre, 40 yards. Is a real question. I mean, practically it's a question, how can musicians over here hear the musicians on the other side of the stage? And we've discovered, sadly, they can't. So we've tried all different systems, giving a conductor glow sticks so they can watch all the way across, pouring a speaker down so people can hear each other. It's an ongoing process of finding it. We know in some of our venues we're going to have a nightmare with reverberation when we're in concrete buildings. So it will both be a very practical question. It will be a practical question of, can people hear what is being said? We have different solutions. We use many different languages in the production. So Frans Fanon is translated into Siswati. Tristan Zara is in isiZulu. There's Tswana, there's Pedi, there's Swahili, there's French, German, a tiny bit of Hungarian. About a kind of Babel. And our port of last call is if words cannot be heard, they will be read. Which means the English text we've got now will be spoken in another language and the English will be what is read.
What I love about this conversation is that I only lead with one leg, which is the kind of the more conceptual or critical leg, and you immediately are able to turn it in to the actual productional problem and the practical problem. And so I want to actually to offer you something which surprised me. We've talked so much about the paradoxes, the differences, the ironies in this whole condition. I came across something, William, that actually moved me. And it somehow sums up the question of movement, the question of walking, distance, language, comprehension, which is that apparently West African, during the treks across Sierra Leone, a new instrument was born, a new musical instrument, which somebody called the metallophone. Let me just read this to you because it said, West Africans borrowed East African cultural accoutrement in the process of being carriers or porterage, and they created something called the metallophone. I found a biscuit tin was used as a sound box, and the half-dozen steel notes were made from perhaps knife blades ground down thin. This instrument does not belong to this country. The idea was brought back by natives who'd been porters in East Africa in the war. And I thought this is a rather beautiful way of taking these often wasted lives, these exploited moments, but turning them into something, into a work which is both crafted and produces its own creative discourse, its own sound, its own music. And I thought this is a kind of motif of the work that you are making for us so generously and so beautifully. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Do you have questions?